Well, welcome to the Freedom Club podcast. I am your host, Curt Mercadante. I'm so very grateful and thankful you are here today because we have a wonderful interview ahead and in store for you. We have Dr. Antony Davies. He's the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, of which I am a huge fan. Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and co-host of a very fun podcast, Words and Numbers. You also write columns for Philadelphia Inquirer and Pittsburgh Tribune Review. I actually did some work in that area for a local congressman whose name shall not be mentioned. But Antony Davies, thank you so much for joining us today.
Curt, thank you for having me.
Well, it is, as I mentioned offline, on this podcast, we talk a lot about abundance mindset versus scarcity mindset. I actually I coined a term called scarcity pimps, because I think there are people in this world, not just when it comes to economics, not just when it comes to politics, but there's people, I talk to a lot of people who, they go on a nice vacation with their family. They're afraid to post pictures because they have those scarcity pimps in their family or network who say, must be nice. They must be doing well. They make those kind of, I use those as kind of clues to find out if it's, or they bastardize the term gratitude to really mean guilt and stagnation. Right. Oh, well, you should just be happy where you're at. Don't rock the boat. Don't reach for more. But then you go beyond that and you have people talking about privilege, inequality on both sides. I actually put on Twitter a couple weeks ago, I said, I'm not voting for anyone who's currently running in the major parties because they're both running based on scarcity and us versus them, that the pie doesn't grow, right? The pie doesn't get higher, as George W. Bush said. On the right, it's us versus them. The them might be foreigners stealing our jobs. And on the left, them might be rich or upper middle class people. So it came at a time, I was watching your video, someone shared it, a common acquaintance shared it, about everything in the world getting better. I have the title and I just totally got it wrong. But the world is becoming a better place. I think right now with the mass shootings going on, I posted on Facebook, do you think, yes or no, global poverty has decreased? All these people wrote, no, it hasn't. It's increased. What about violence? Has it increased or decreased? No, it's increasing. And then I see your video. So is everything getting worse or is everything getting better?
Well, we can always point to some things that are getting worse, but the vast majority of metrics are all pointing to the world becoming a better place. I'll say this to people, and they start off, as you suggested, not believing me, but then I'll lay out the data, and their response is, well, okay, maybe things are getting better, but that's no reason that we shouldn't want to improve them. And that's, this isn't a story about sitting back on our laurels and saying, we don't need to care about the poor because everything's taken care of, but rather it's an attempt to be realistic about what's happening. Because if we really care about the poor, or we really care about inequality, or whatever it is, we really care about the environment, then yes, it's important to see where we've done things wrong, but it's, I would say, even more important to be aware of where we've done things right. Because if we've done things right somewhere, that tells us we need to do more of this thing because this works, whatever it is.
Yeah. A lot of times I'll talk about abundance versus scarcity, and some people confuse that as just some sort of mindset or psychological trickery, or it's just positive thinking and optimism. And I don't think it's any of that. I think it's more, I can't remember who said it, but I'm not an optimist, I'm a possibilist. Not only looking at what we've done right, does that go to the heart? When I talk about an abundance mindset or thinking with abundance, what does that mean to you?
It calls to mind the Nobel laureate in economics, Julian Simon, when asked about the world overpopulation. People say, well, we've got so many people, we're going to run out of resources and so forth. And what do we do about this? And Simon's response was, have more children, which is, of course, counterintuitive. But what he was saying was, look, a particular resource, be it oil or uranium or whatever, a particular resource may be fixed, but resources in general aren't. And they aren't because of human ingenuity. We discover ways to use things that we didn't know before. So once upon a time, the major resource for heating your home in the winter was wood. And then we discovered the use of whale oil. And then we discovered petroleum oil. Then we discovered coal. Then we discovered nuclear energy. And with each discovery, we're creating a resource out of something that wasn't a resource before. And you might argue that, well, there's got to be a limit to human ingenuity. You can only do so much. Maybe that's the case, but there's been no indication anywhere that there's a limit to human ingenuity. If anything, it's the reverse. There have been plenty of indications that the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I mean, we were supposed to run out of oil. We were supposed to, whether it's Al Gore or, Soylent Green or some of the predictions of the 70s, I mean, the world was basically supposed to end by now. Right. And getting proven wrong time and again hasn't stopped them from continuing to say, well, now it's by 2023, the seas are going to rise by 10 feet, which means, England will be wiped out, Florida will not exist, and all of those things, right?
Well, because each time it's different this time. Right. But it isn't. It really isn't.
If I try not to get into is climate change, is global warming, whatever you want, is it a real thing? And I almost start from a period of, let's say it is. Let's say there's a problem, right? I mean, hey, everyone's for the environment. We live on the marsh, we live on the water. I grew up in Illinois, I wasn't used to that. And I see crap floating in the marsh and I want to go punch someone,
Right.
But let's start from a place of, okay, when you look at the environment and you look back over the last, 50, 70 years, you've studied the data, it's human ingenuity and innovation as we've gotten wealthier as a world that has has cleaned up the world, right, in the environment.
Yeah, very much so. And this is part of the problem. People get bent out of shape that the United States isn't a signatory on the Kyoto protocols, this sort of thing. And the fact of the matter is, if the United States could wave a magic wand and reduce its carbon emissions to zero overnight, it still wouldn't solve the problem, because the problem isn't coming from the United States predominantly. It's coming from China and India. But China and India they're taking the steps from the agrarian pre-industrial economies into full-fledged industrial technology economies. We did that too. And when we did it, we emitted tons of pollution. But you come through that to the other side, and now you have the infrastructure, you have the technology, you're able to adopt cleaner technologies, cleaner production processes. We did that. China and India are doing it too. In fact, they'll do it faster than we did because we've already blazed the trail. We know what works and what doesn't. And so in some sense, what the United States does doesn't matter. In another sense, and this is what bothers me a lot about these conversations, and I have to put a huge footnote here. I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know anything about it. I'm simply an economist. But one of the things that economics teaches us is that to all things, there are trade-offs. And what bothers me about every conversation I've heard about climate change is that the focus is only on the costs. And I'll take it for granted. It's not my field. I'll admit whatever costs you're claiming exist. But what also exists, and I know it's there, are benefits. And nobody's talking about what the benefits are. Vast tracts of land in Canada are going to become arable. Canada could become the breadbasket of the world the way the Midwest was. I live in Pittsburgh. Frankly, I wouldn't mind it at all if the temperature rose a bit. There are benefits. Now, you can argue, well, the benefits are small compared to the costs. That's fine. But show me what those benefits are. Show me that they're less than the costs. Or at least let me know, if you're asking us to spend trillions of dollars to fight this problem, what is the net cost as opposed to just the cost?
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of much of this, it seems to me, as back to your point about human ingenuity, I mean, the ability to grow crops on smaller places of land. We already have drought resistant crops. We use less land. That in and of itself takes care of something that they're talking about as a cost, right?
Yep.
I mean, heck, you look at, I think it might have been FEE that recently put it out. It was the anniversary of the invention of the air conditioner. You know, you look at that and preventing disease. I mean, that was human ingenuity that cleaned something up without any medicines, without, you know, those clean water. And so I'm a big believer that the future of humanity, I think two of the biggest threats are apathy and conformity, and fueled in many cases by, it's not just a schooling system. When I say the schooling system, I also mean parenting, et cetera, of sit down, shut up, memorize, learn, standardize, and that's it. And with that, yeah, if that's the way we go, then kind of the forces of doom out there who are speaking about AI taking our jobs and the environment ending and you have these people like Elon Musk. Now, I know he's not a perfect individual. I know a lot of people say, well, he takes a lot of government money. He does this. He's doing things that haven't been done before. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. I don't know. But he's someone who broke out of that mold of apathy and conformity. And you have those, Steve Jobs did the same thing. They're not competing with others. They're just kind of playing, you know, Peter Thiel and seasteading and those types of things. Do you feel that when it comes to, and I actually want to get back to how specifically the world is becoming a better place, with this scarcity mindset that becomes easily succumbed to fear-mongering,
right,
and kind of the wave of social media, the world is ending, Chicken Little. Why do you think we're more susceptible to that today than we were in the past because of the sheer amount of media messages coming in our brain? Or has this always been there and we just didn't know it because we only talked to our, you know, we didn't have it within, immediate, there's a mass shooting now. We know about it 2 minutes later.
Yeah. I don't think I'd choose the word susceptible. I would guess that it's a survival response that we've learned over eons, that it's beneficial to us, to society, to relate bad news because it's a warning. You know, I saw this thing in the woods and it attacked and ate my dog. For God's sake, don't go in there, right? And that news spreads, and it helps to protect us. What's changed, I think, if you put your finger on it, it's not that we've become more susceptible, but rather that there's a greater opportunity to get bad news because we carry, the phone in the pocket, and I can find out news about what's going on the other side of the planet within seconds of it actually occurring. And because of that, and by the way, I can then forward it to friends, right? So the ability to be aware of bad news and to share bad news is working on, hyper thrusters. We can do all this stuff. And so we share the bad news.
So let's talk about some good news. What in the world, how is the world becoming better? I know you say about poverty, alleviation. We've talked a little bit about the environment, talk about violence. How is the world getting better?
In all sorts of ways. The one I'd love to point to is poverty. And these numbers come from the United Nations, and you can argue about definitions of poverty, but what they have done is they define extreme poverty, which is living on the equivalent of what in the US we would call roughly $1.90 a day. That's extreme poverty. That's the extreme poverty line. And of course, there are adjustments for differences in costs of living across countries. And this number was 200 years ago around 98%. 98% of the world lived in extreme poverty, and it dropped to about, I'd say, 70% when our grandparents were around, down to maybe 50-40% in our parents' time. When we were in college, it would have been around 30%, and today it's less than 10%. And it's been dropping at the same time that the population has been rising. So 200 years ago, Thomas Malthus writes his work of, we use the term Malthusian, which comes from him, of the world is going to hell in a handbasket, right? And he looks around, he sees world population growing exponentially and 98% poverty rate, and says, oh my God, we're all going to die. And from Thomas Malthus' point to the present, not only does world poverty fall, but the population, I think it was 800 million at the time that Malthus was around, and now it's 8 billion. or coming up on 8 billion. So we're roughly 10 times the number of people and 1/10 the poverty. So that's kind of the big thing I hold out to say, look, this is a big way the world's become a better place. One of the things that people will respond with is, well, yeah, but what about inequality? You know, some people becoming very rich, other people becoming poor. And of course, inequality has been rising in this country, and there's a number of problems with that figure, but you could just look at the number and see it's been rising, although it hasn't been rising that much. But if you look worldwide, poverty is down, or excuse me, income inequality is down. So too are other types, like gender inequality, how women are treated versus men. That's down over the past 1 or 2 generations. Child labor rates are down. Longevity and education are up. All these ways, all these things that we would tend to point to and say, that's indicative of a healthy society. Those numbers have all been steadily improving.
Does inequality, let's take at face value their stats about inequality rising and all that. Does it even matter? And I know there's some, me even asking that question, oh, you're so mean, but when you are so focused on inequality, isn't it at its heart? I mean, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, they make an extra billion. Now you could argue, well, they're not nice people, whatever. I don't care. I'm not saying they're great people. I don't know them. How does that affect you? You know, does it matter, or is it just envy?
Yeah, I think that the concern with inequality, now there are some serious concerns, but they tend to be very small amongst economists as compared to what you hear in the media. But the concern, I think, goes back to a point you started us off with, and that is this mindset. Are you in the mindset of, what are the 2 terms you used?
Scarcity and abundance?
Yes, scarcity and abundance. If you're in a mindset of scarcity, then your worldview is everything you have is something I don't. And the more you get, the less is available for me. That's the mindset of scarcity. And so if you buy into that mindset, then by definition, any increase in inequality is also an increase in poverty, because the more Bill Gates has, the less the rest of us have. And at some point, he has so much that we now become poor because the pie is only so large. And that's patently false. It goes against everything we understand about economics. And if you don't like economics, it goes against everything we have observed about the reality of the world. That the world is not a fixed pie. It's a variable size pie. And the harder we work, the more ingenious we are, the more we concentrate on satisfying our fellow people, the bigger the pie gets.
Yeah. I'm here in South Carolina, and I'm originally from Chicago. And I think South Carolina is now 1 or 2 ranked for inward migration, and Illinois is like number 1 for outward migration. Okay. And people there still don't buy into it. It's still that scarcity versus abundance. But I remember in the early 2000s, and I remember when Jim DeMint, he was a congressman, he was running for Senate. And I was working in DC at the time, and he gave a speech. And he gave a free trade speech, which at the time, living in South Carolina, they were going in the midst of this. The textile industry was being dismantled.
Right. And
to be pro-free trade was unheard of. And he said, well, no, here's the deal. You look now, you fast forward almost 20 years, and South Carolina's, I'm here in Charleston, it's becoming a high-tech hub. You have Boeing, you have Volvo, you have all of these. We replaced the textile jobs. But then you look at the Rust Belt, and a lot of them have not. They're almost stuck in that. I would say that's why they latched on in many cases to the Make America Great Again message. Because bring the factories back, bring them back. Whereas some states like a South Carolina and many states across the South reinvented themselves and grew out of that.
Yeah. And I think this ties back to where we started with the climate change discussion. I submit that what really people are afraid of is change, period. And you see it when you talk about the climate. Things are changing. Footnote, that means bad. When you talk about trade, free trade means that some businesses in this country are going to falter, other ones might rise, but that's change and that's bad. You see when you talk about immigration, people are going to come into this country. It's going to change the nature of this country. That's change. When you get into the mindset that change equals bad by definition, in some sense, that's consonant with the idea of scarcity, because a fixed pie is one that doesn't change. But if you want a world of abundance, then you have to embrace change, because the growing pie, that's one of the pieces of change.
Here in Charleston, we actually have, Charleston was a small city for many years, and we have, I don't know, it's 43 people a day or something moving here, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. And with that comes some change and issues related to infrastructure and building homes and supply and demand. Well, there's a lot of folks who moved here with money. They come here and then they said, well, no, now let's shut the door. So They start passing housing moratoriums. So now what happens? It's like what happened in Silicon Valley. The housing prices start rising. There are people who are so afraid of the change. There's bumper stickers that actually read, "Go back to Ohio." Wow. There's so many people from Ohio. And, it's writ large, I guess. It's happening on a national stage, and again, it's that us versus them. It seems to me that whether you're a Republican or Democrat, the them is different, depending, but it's all fixed pie related.
Yeah, and I wonder, now that we talk about it, if fear of change at its root is due to a pessimistic outlook on the world, that change is bad because the world is a bad place, and if I'm happy now, any change is going to make me worse by definition. But if you have a what do I want to say, a forward-looking, a happy view of the world, that the world is a kind place, it's a good place, people are generally good. Yes, there are wackos amongst us who shoot up people, but they tend to be way out on the distribution. The bulk of human beings are actually quite good and noble people. If you have that view of the world, then change all of a sudden becomes your friend. It's not your enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned violence, or you mentioned shootings. Violence has plummeted. I think I saw Reason magazine yesterday had a story from, I don't remember, but it was a study from a criminologist. I forget where he's at, talking about mass shootings actually being on the decline. Offline, we talked about, you talk about that in your video, in your FEECon speech about violence plummeting. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's not a right-wing conservative libertarian by any means, shared just some stats about how many people and where they died. I think Steven Pinker in his book actually talked about terrorism. We went to Europe and everyone's like, oh, be careful, be careful. And you look, actually, the number of people who die from just falling down the stairs. Right. I think you pointed out you're more likely to choke on your lunch that they were eating while they were speaking than you are to die in a mass shooting. Is it true that violence is plummeting in the world?
Yes, it is. If you look at deaths due to war, and forget about World War II, so post-World War II, deaths due to war are down 95%. 95%. That's almost all of them, right? Do we still have wars? Yes. Do people are civilians still being killed and children? Yes. Is it horrible? Yes. We should stop it. But it's 5% of what it was some time ago. In this country, deaths due to shootings are down 50%. Firearm-related crime is down 85%. This is since the 1990s. And one of the things, you have to be a little bit careful when you hear about these things, because people will say things like, they'll talk about mass shootings. And I'm suspicious of anybody who quotes mass shootings, because it shouldn't matter to us whether 5 people are killed all at once or whether they're killed on subsequent days. The fact is 5 people are killed. That should concern us. So let's put aside mass shootings for a minute and look at killings. And even there you have to be careful, because people will quote firearm deaths or gun deaths. And the problem with gun deaths is, in this country, 2/3 of them are suicides.
Right.
Now, the suicide problem, should we be concerned about it? Yes. But when we talk about gun deaths, generally speaking, what we have in our head is not suicide, it's person A killing person B. But the problem there is, if you're really concerned about person A killing person B, what does it matter what the person uses? We shouldn't be talking about gun deaths. We should be talking about deaths or homicides. And a good poster child for this is Australia. Australia, back in the 1990s, I think it was around 1995, banned firearms. They had a mandatory buyback. You had to bring your firearm in, and you got paid for it. And the government.
This was following. Wasn't there a shooting on a train, or there was something that happened? Right?
Yeah, it was
in response to that. Yeah,
mass shooting. But if you look at the numbers following that gun confiscation in Australia, the number of firearm deaths declines, but the number of knife homicides rises. And it rises by less, but it rises by a significant enough amount that when you add it all up, the total homicides aren't dropping that much. And what's mind-blowing is to realize over the same period, U.S. firearm deaths are declining precipitously when we didn't have a ban. But here's Australia banning them, and many people are just would-be killers or shifting from guns to knives. Yeah. So I think it's important when we think about these things to make sure we're looking at the right metrics.
It's John Lott. I'm sure you know John Lott, and I know people have taken issue with some of his stuff or whatever, but he shared something about I'm sure they were homicides, but gun-related homicides. He shared that it was like 51% of them in the U.S. occur within 2 counties. But even within those counties, like LA, it's not in Beverly Hills. It's in a certain segment of LA. And it's interesting because it's become now the way that some people like the president throw it out there. He throws it out at a certain time, but it's almost become, like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He pointed out data about the number of people who died choking or drowning versus that. It's almost become that, well, in some cases, if you point it out and you point out, all right, certain parts of LA County or Cook County or DC or Philadelphia or whatever, you're racist, right? Because data now equals mindset or whatever you want to call it. But it also is a sense of, I was just thinking about some of the Twitter comments, which are always fun to read, in response to Neil deGrasse Tyson, that this is why scientists shouldn't be in charge because there's nothing in there about emotion. And one of the things that I read and I saw, and I read it and I was like, oh, I thought it was going to go a different way. You had a piece about outcomes versus principles.
Right.
And I actually was surprised by reading when you started off saying, maybe don't focus on outcomes, focus on principles. I think I read it a little bit of the wrong way because when I think of outcomes, I think of data, or I think of, well, in the end, not that many people died, so let's base it on that. Whereas I think of people on the other side, no, principles are no one should die by a gun, therefore we have to change it. But maybe I read it wrong.
Yeah, when we talk about, my colleague James Harrigan and I talked about this, and we talk about principles versus outcome, we're talking about in the context of politicians who, and you see this, actually, I've seen it with all the politicians, the current Democratic slate, with the exception of Buttigieg. And what I'm seeing is politicians stepping up and saying, we want the following things, and then they start to list them: free college, or raise minimum wage, or reduce the debt, whatever it is. They have this laundry list of things they want, as opposed to starting from a principle. What do we believe? Well, we believe that people should have a right to their property, that people should be secure in their life and their belongings and these sorts of things. And if we can agree on those principles, and I think most people can, you then take the next step. Well, what do they imply, these principles? And if you follow them logically, they will lead to a platform of outcomes. But what you get is a platform of outcomes that are internally consistent. They don't contradict one another because they came from principles, as opposed to when we say things like, well, we should raise the minimum wage, and your body is yours. No one should tell you what to do with your body. Well, those two outcomes are inconsistent, because one says that your body is yours, so you can do with it what you want. The other one says, but you can't sell your labor unless you can find someone willing to pay you more than $15 an hour. Well, hang on a minute. Is my body mine or isn't it? And notice you have these two outcomes that are now conflicting.
Interesting. Yeah, I think the words we use differently and in context. Because a lot of times I always say that we'd be better off if we made policy based on outcomes, desired outcomes, and you clearly define them. But like free college isn't necessarily an outcome, or what I ask teachers is, well, what is for high schools? Well, we're getting better outcomes. We've innovated, and so we're getting better outcomes. Well, what's the better outcome? Better test scores. Okay, is the test score an outcome? Well, no. Then they get into college. Is getting into college the outcome for a life?
Right.
Well,
right.
no, because they get into college, they get a better job. Well, A, is that true? And B, is that the outcome, or is it a life of meaning or fulfillment? Or okay, and then you go past there, and you start to unravel some of the,
right.
I guess, principles and outcomes. We're kind of using them in different but similar ways.
I would use a different term where you use the word outcome. I'd use the word evidence. So we have this principle. We believe it to be true. We want to pursue it, and we're going to enact the following policies. So I would then ask for evidence. So you talk about gun control in this country. If your principle is we want to reduce gun deaths, okay, show me evidence that this particular policy you want to enact is going to have the effects that you want to have. And there, way too many of us go off the rails, because if you ask for evidence, well, clearly you don't have a heart, or you're just trying to obfuscate the problem with data, that if you really cared about this, you would do the following things. Well, actually, it's the reverse. If you really cared about reducing the number of gun deaths, you would sit down and think critically what's going to achieve that versus what won't achieve that, not in terms of what I feel, but in terms of what the actual evidence is.
Yeah, I got in a discussion with someone actually at my boxing gym, and we were talking, he brought up inequality, and he said, I'm a nationalist, that's why I support this and that, and I'm a free trader, and he was not. And he was, truth be told, I think he used to be, but because certain politicians change their tune, he changes his tune, right? And in asking him about inequality, I said, well, but everyone's getting better off. What do you care if Jim is getting richer faster than you? If you take away his car, does that make you feel better? No. Or might make you feel better. It doesn't actually make you better off. And he said, well, the inequality has gotten out of hand, and he started quoting the Bible. And at that point I said, okay, it's not about winning or losing, but the evidence doesn't matter to him. To him, it's more about the feel good.
Yeah.
Right?
So and here's the problem here, because I've had similar conversations with people, and my response to them is, look, what you're saying inequality, but really what you're doing is it's what's motivating you is envy, but you're dressing it up in moral garb and saying, well, it's inequality, we need to do something. No, it's envy. How do I know it's envy? Because if you really cared, as you say you do, about inequality, you would be emptying your pockets and sending the money and emptying your bank account and sending it to the poor people out there. Why? Because to be a 1%er on planet Earth, you need to earn about $40,000, which makes almost every working American a 1%er. So, but what do? We don't look down at the oceans of people who earn less than us. We look up at the very few who earn more and say, well, that's not fair. But if you really want to talk about fair, look the other direction.
So the world is getting better, and it has happened at an increasing rate over the past half century, while many countries, and I assume this is why, one reason it's getting better from an economic perspective, and I would say violence and a number of these other factors, as countries have switched from totalitarian-based to capitalist-based. I mean, even China. I mean, China's kind of got this weird, right, communist capitalist deal, but their economic growth has gone up. I mean, you look at Eastern Europe, you looked at a number of places in, Africa is, or South America, Asia. So why do so many people feel that capitalism is a failure and inherently evil?
I think the problem here is that people confuse capitalism and cronyism. So they see a system in which a billionaire can pay off politicians to get favorable legislation, or lobbyists spend millions of dollars to get legislation that helps certain people at the expense of others. And people, rightly so, point to that and say that's a problem. But where they go off the rails is their next statement, where they say this is a problem because people are greedy. People are just after money. It's it's not that. People are, if you want to use the term greedy, fine. People are greedy, just as greedy in a socialist system as they are in a capitalist system. It's not a function of the system. It's a function of the human being. We want more stuff. Okay. Well, the problem here is when you see these rich people, co-opting the government to their benefit, that's not capitalism, it's cronyism. And it exists in a capitalist system. It also exists in a socialist system. You can look at Venezuela right now, where 99% of the population is living in extreme poverty, but 1% of them aren't. And if you check it out, what you'll find is the 1% are people who have co-opted the leadership, the government, to give them what they want to the cost of everyone else. It's cronyism. And
I would assume it's similar in China.
Oh yeah, it's that way everywhere.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people don't understand well enough about free market people, is that when free market people say we should have less government, they aren't saying we should have more cronyism. Actually, it's quite the reverse. They're saying we should have less cronyism. The reason you have cronyism is not because you have rich people buying politicians. It's because the politicians are for sale to begin with. And if government is limited, it can only do certain things. That dramatically limits what the politicians are able to sell to the rich people. Interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be interesting to see what happens here over the next, year with the elections. But I think this wave of authoritarian populism is here, ever since probably around 2007, 2008. We saw it when I was in my agency and a lot of polling, and people were against anything big business, big government on the right, and anything big business and big whatever, rich people, individuals on the left. And what's coming out of it is somewhere between, it's authoritarian populism, and I don't think it's good for America, because I think it's based on that scarcity, that fixed pie. Real quick, I wanted to get your thoughts, because I told you I listened to your and James Harrigan's podcast on college, and everyone's talking about free college. Isn't that great? And you, as an employee of the higher education industry, but someone who works in the free enterprise, Foundation for Economic Enterprise. We talk about Isaac Morehouse. My wife and I homeschool. You talk about what are the outcomes or the evidence of high school and college, and I've seen conflicting data on college grads versus not just the pay, but then the debt and the loans. But then you layer on top of that the huge financial implications of what's happening now vis-a-vis what happened in a very similar vein with the housing crisis and the federal backstop and investments and tons of fingers and ropes and strings into the system. What do you think, where do you see 5 or 10 years down the line, whether it's the economic bubble just absolutely bursting and flooding all over the place, but also the changes in the economy spurring changes in higher education now? Where do you see higher education going with all of these vast changes to the economy, the student loan issue and crisis and all that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we're at a nexus right now. The answer to your question hinges on what happens next, possibly at the next election. If we get a bunch of politicians in who are trumpeting this free college thing, we're going to go one direction. And that direction is colleges will become even more bloated than they are. We're going to have more students going to college who have no business going to college, not because they're stupid, but because their skill set does not lie in thinking about things, but rather doing things. And we have trade schools that teach you how to do things. That's the appropriate place. We're going to have a tremendous number of students majoring in, and the colleges encouraging them to major in, courses of study that have no market value. The colleges will encourage this. Why? Because they've got faculty who need to do something. So let's put some students in front of them. Come take this basket weaving course. We've got 5 faculty can teach us. This is great. And you get out into the world and you can't earn any money. What does the college care? They're done with you, right? You're gone. Oh, in fact, if the college education is free, you don't even care. We've left the taxpayer with the bill. So that's one direction we'll go if we end up with this free college. The other direction is much more interesting. If we can avoid this push to free college, I think what we're going to see, and we're starting to see it already, is businesses and students coming to the realization that a college degree is not this valuable thing that people have been claiming. Now, some of the majors are very valuable. Some of the majors are not valuable at all, but it's the choice of major where the value lies, not the college degree itself. And so you're going to have businesses, to an extent, no longer requiring college degrees. If you can demonstrate to me that you're a go-getter, you're an independent thinker, whatever, by some means other than holding up a diploma, fine, I'll come and hire you. Students, likewise, because the thing is becoming so expensive, they're going to be looking for alternatives. And what will you get? I think what we'll get is something on the order of, roughly speaking, 25% of colleges going bankrupt in the next 20 years. They'll just be gone. Dramatic reduction in the number of students in college, dramatic increase in interesting entrepreneurial alternatives. Like you talk about Isaac Morehouse's thing. Imagine that at a college level where I and maybe some other academics get together and we put up a website and we say, if you want to be educated in economics, here's the things you need to know. Go study it. Oh, and if you want us to sign off, I'm a PhD, I'll sign off and say, you know everything that's necessary that someone with an undergraduate degree in economics would know. Then you read all this stuff, you come back, I'll give you some exams, and if you pass, I'll sign you off, you pay me $100 and we're done. Would a model like that work long term? I don't know. There's pros and cons to it, but the fact is people will start to think entrepreneurially about how we can educate and create value in new ways.
Yeah, it's Apple and Google have already started hiring people, and they said we got to train them anyways, or retrain them. Might as well just get it direct from the source, right? And I imagine that some of those companies may end up maybe starting their own version of schools and hiring professors like, hey, we need great economists here. Let's just school them here, right? And
since we're talking about this, I think there's an interesting tweak that could be made right now that would dramatically change higher education for the better. And that tweak is for the government no longer to be subsidizing student loans. Get out of the student loan market entirely. Require that the colleges use their endowments to underwrite student loans. So if you want to come to my, ABC University, I've got my endowment. With that, I'll underwrite the loan. When you graduate, you then have to pay back into this. Of course, some of you won't, some of you will, whatever it is. But the college itself underwrites the degree. If that's the case, notice how the incentives change. All of a sudden, the college becomes hyper-focused on my students, when they get out, being able to hold down a job that's valuable, because if they can't, then they won't pay back the loans. And we have an example of this. The example is Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. His whole thing was to make the car available to the middle class. And he had the same problem of, how do you get people to buy this thing that's so expensive? He created a separate company that financed the people who are buying cars from Ford Motor Company. It's the same model. We've done it and it works.
Interesting. That is that is wonderful or great. And because right now, I think, gosh, well, you look at a state like Illinois, it's like 80 cents of every dollar, I think, goes to the pensions of university employees. And I'm not saying those aren't good people, but some of those folks they never see a classroom. They never do anything. They never get out in the world. They never, and so they would be incentivized. Yeah, like you said, moving the incentives to where they actually fuel cost savings and outcomes and evidence. Well, let's end on this question. It's a question I ask every single guest on this podcast. And that is, what does the word freedom mean to you?
Freedom means honoring the human condition. That for me to be free requires that you honor me as a human being, that you don't oppress me, and that you honor me in using your freedom well, that, we exchange peacefully. You don't take my stuff, and vice versa. You acknowledge that I'm a human being and I have freedom, and that freedom implies an obligation on me not to oppress you. And so in a weird way, people who are concerned about equality, in a true sense, equality of human beings, should be embracing freedom, because that's where it starts.
Wonderful. On that note, Dr. Davies, thank you so much for joining us on the Freedom Club podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.